Mental strength: how to stay unshaken in difficult situations. You have already been tested. Not in the abstract sense of having experienced difficulty. Everyone has experienced difficulty. In the specific, revealing sense of having been placed in a situation where what you are made of was on the line, where the comfortable options were removed, where the pressure was real, the stakes were genuine, and the quality of who you are was not hidden behind the ordinary circumstances that usually conceal it. You have been in that place, and what happened there, how you held or did not hold, how you thought or could not think, how you behaved under conditions that were designed by their nature to produce degraded behavior. That is the most honest information about the current state of your mental strength that you have available. Most people do not examine that information honestly. They remember the test, selectively emphasizing the parts where they performed well, minimizing the parts where they did not, constructing a narrative of the experience that protects the self-image rather than builds the capacity. This is a natural response. It is also a specific form of waste. The test has provided the most valuable information available, the direct evidence of where the architecture is strong and where it is not, and the defensive narrative is using that information to protect rather than to build. This audiobook asks you to do something different with the tests you have faced and the tests that are coming. To use the honest assessment of what the difficult situations have revealed about the current state of your mind as the precise diagnostic from which a more developed architecture can be built. Not the architecture of the person who is not tested. That person does not exist. And the life organized around avoiding tests is a life organized around avoiding the conditions that produce genuine mental strength. The architecture of the person who is tested and holds, who faces the difficulty with the specific qualities, the resilience, the discipline, the emotional steadiness, the trained capacity to remain functional when the pressure is specifically trying to make functioning difficult, that transform testing from a threat into a training ground. 10 chapters, each layer of the mental strength architecture, built in the order that makes each layer the prerequisite for the next. By the end, the way you understand difficulty, face fear, maintain discipline, and govern your inner state in the conditions that most consistently undermine those capacities will be specifically and substantially different. The question is not if life will test you. It is not when. The tests are already here, in the ordinary difficulties of ordinary days, and more significant ones are already being arranged by the normal trajectory of a genuinely engaged life. The question is who will be standing on the other side of them, and whether the answer to that question will be determined by the current architecture or the developed one. Introduction. What mental strength actually is. Mental strength is the capacity to remain functionally effective, to think clearly, to behave deliberately, to maintain the standards you have set for yourself in the conditions that are specifically designed to make these things difficult. The phrase specifically designed matters. The conditions that test mental strength are not random adversity. They are the conditions that target the specific vulnerabilities of the human cognitive and emotional system. They produce the activation that narrows thinking. They create the urgency that compresses decision-making. They deliver the social pressure that makes maintaining unpopular positions costly. They sustain the discomfort that makes the easier path look increasingly reasonable. Each of these conditions is a specific challenge to a specific dimension of mental strength. And the strength that holds across all of them is not a single unified quality, but a developed architecture of specific capacities that together produce the unshaken functioning that this audiobook builds. Mental strength is not the absence of feeling. The person who feels no pressure in difficult situations has not built mental strength. They have either not been in genuinely difficult situations or are not registering them accurately. The strong mind feels the pressure fully. What is different is what happens next. The strong mind does not translate the pressure into degraded functioning. It uses the pressure as the condition in which the developed capacities demonstrate their value. That is the strength, not the absence of the test, the capacity that the test reveals. Chapter 1 begins with the most foundational understanding that the test is universal, that what it reveals is specific, and that both the revelation and the test itself are the raw material of the development that the following 9 chapters describe. Chapter 1. Life tests everyone. The question is not if life will test you, but when. The universality of the test is the first thing to understand about it precisely. Because misunderstanding it produces the specific cognitive error that makes the test harder and the development slower. The belief that the difficulty is exceptional, that it is happening to you specifically rather than to everyone who lives an engaged life, that your experience of being tested represents something particular about your situation rather than the universal condition of being alive and invested in the outcome. The difficulty is not exceptional. The form it takes is specific to your life, specific to the relationships you have built, the commitments you have made, the vulnerabilities you carry, the goals you are pursuing. But the existence of the difficulty, the certainty that it will arrive, and the specific quality of what it reveals about the current state of your mental architecture, these are universal. Every person living a genuine life is tested. The only people who are not tested are the people who have arranged their lives around avoiding the conditions that produce testing. And the cost of that arrangement is the specific smallness of the untested life. Understanding the universality shifts the relationship to difficulty from the defensive to the developmental. The defensive relationship treats each difficulty as an exception to be survived and recovered from. The developmental relationship treats each difficulty as the inevitable occurrence of the conditions that produce growth, as the specific circumstance in which the capacities described in this audiobook are either deployed effectively, demonstrating their development, or deployed ineffectively, demonstrating the specific areas that still need work. The developmental relationship to difficulty is not optimism. It is the specific cognitive reframe that is most consistent with the actual evidence. Difficulty is certain. The outcome of difficulty is uncertain, and the factor most determining the outcome of difficulty is the mental architecture of the person experiencing it. If this is true, and the evidence of human experience across every culture and every era consistently suggests that it is, then the rational investment is in the architecture rather than in the attempt to prevent the difficulty. The difficulty is coming regardless. The question is what the architecture will do with it when it arrives. The specific types of testing that life produces can be grouped into 3 broad categories, each of which challenges a somewhat different dimension of the mental strength architecture. The first category is acute difficulty, the sudden, high-intensity test that arrives without preparation time and requires immediate functioning under conditions of genuine pressure. The crisis, the failure, the unexpected loss, the situation that goes wrong quickly and demands response before the full picture has been assembled. This category tests the specific dimensions of pressure management, the availability of the deliberate mind under activation, and the capacity to remain functionally oriented when the disorientation is strongest. The second category is chronic difficulty, the sustained, ongoing test that does not produce a single acute crisis, but requires the maintenance of functional quality across an extended period of difficult conditions. The protracted professional challenge, the sustained relationship difficulty, the long period of uncertainty about outcomes that matter deeply. This category tests the specific dimensions of endurance, of the maintenance of discipline when the motivation has long since exhausted itself, and of the capacity to sustain functional quality when the conditions for sustaining it are continuously being eroded. The third category is developmental difficulty, the type of testing that is built into the structure of genuine growth. Every time a person extends genuinely beyond their current capability, takes on the work that is above their current level, engages in the relationship that requires more of them than they have previously given, pursues the goal that demands capacities they do not yet fully possess, they are inviting the specific difficulty that growth requires. This category tests the specific dimensions of the relationship to failure. The capacity to maintain engagement when the outcome is uncertain and the current performance is genuinely below the intended standard, and the specific form of resilience that allows the continued investment in a developing capacity before the investment has produced the results that would justify it. These three categories are not mutually exclusive. A single extended period of difficulty may contain all three simultaneously, but distinguishing them is useful for the developmental relationship, because each category calls for the somewhat different deployment of the mental strength capacities. The acute test calls most acutely for the pressure management and the regulated functioning under activation. The chronic test calls most acutely for the endurance and the discipline practices. The developmental test calls most acutely for the resilience and the specific relationship to failure that allows continued engagement without the external validation that mature development always proceeds without in its most important phases. The question is not if life will test you. The tests are already present in the ordinary days of an ordinary engaged life, and the more significant tests are already implicit in the genuine commitments and genuine aspirations that make the life worth living. The building of the mental strength that the tests reveal the current state of that is the project of this audiobook. It begins in the next chapter with the specific examination of what the different responses to testing reveal about the minds that produce them. Chapter 2. Weak minds versus strong minds. Strength is revealed during adversity. The words weak and strong applied to minds require immediate precision. They are not moral categories. They are not descriptions of character. They are descriptions of the current state of a developed capacity, the capacity to remain functionally effective in difficult conditions. The weak mind, in the sense used in this chapter, is the undertrained mind, the mind that has not yet built the specific architecture that produces functional effectiveness under the pressure. The uncertainty, the sustained discomfort, and the acute activation that difficult conditions generate. The strong mind is the trained one. The distinction is not fixed. The same person who has a weak mind in response to certain types of difficulty may have a strong mind in response to others because the architecture has been built in some domains and not in others. The strength and the weakness are both domain-specific and trainable. What is not useful is the categorical self-assessment of either kind. The person who identifies as mentally weak and uses the identification as the explanation for their failures under pressure, or the person who identifies as mentally strong and uses the identification as the reason not to examine where the architecture is actually still underdeveloped. With that precision established, the examination of what distinguishes the responses of the developed and the underdeveloped mind to the same difficult conditions is genuinely informative, not as a moral assessment but as a diagnostic that identifies the specific capacities whose development is most required. The underdeveloped mind's primary response to adversity is the catastrophization sequence, the rapid, automatic escalation from the specific difficult circumstance to the most threatening general interpretation of what it means. The setback becomes evidence of the fundamental inadequacy. The failure becomes evidence of the permanent instability. The criticism becomes evidence of the underlying worthlessness. The difficulty becomes evidence that the situation is hopeless. Each of these escalations is the work of the mind's pattern matching system, applying the most threatening available interpretation to the incoming evidence, and the most threatening available interpretation is always available, because the pattern library includes every difficult experience that has ever produced a threatening meaning. The specific cost of the catastrophization sequence is not primarily the accuracy of the conclusion, which is typically significantly overstated, but the behavioral consequences of the conclusion. The mind that has concluded that the setback represents fundamental inadequacy does not behave the same way as the mind that has concluded that the setback represents a specific, bounded, addressable difficulty. The first mind is defending against the threat to itself inept. The second mind is addressing the specific problem. The first mind is producing significantly degraded behavior for a significantly inflated perception of the threat. The developed mind's primary response to the same adversity is the accurate assessment sequence, the specific, factual, bounded description of what has actually happened, without the catastrophization escalation that the underdeveloped mind's pattern matching system would automatically apply. The setback is a setback with specific features, specific causes, and specific paths forward. The failure is a failure in this specific domain at this specific level of development, with specific information about where the development still needs to go. The criticism is feedback with specific content, varying in accuracy, with varying degrees of relevance to the genuine development of the criticized capacity. The accurate assessment is not optimism. It is not the forced reframing of difficulties as hidden gifts or the denial of the genuine weight of what has happened. It is the specific cognitive discipline of describing the situation as it actually is, without the amplification that the threat detection system automatically adds, and engaging with what it actually is rather than with the catastrophized version. The second distinguishing feature between the underdeveloped and the developed mind under adversity is the relationship to uncertainty. Adversity almost always involves uncertainty about the outcome, about the duration, about the correct path forward. The underdeveloped mind's relationship to this uncertainty is primarily one of intolerance. The uncertainty is itself experienced as threatening, producing the activation that the uncertain outcome has not yet actually produced. and driving the premature resolution of the uncertainty through commitments to specific interpretations or specific paths that the actual evidence does not yet warrant. The developed mind has built the specific tolerance for uncertainty that allows engagement with ambiguous, unresolved situations without the premature closure that the underdeveloped mind's intolerance produces. This tolerance is not comfort with uncertainty. Genuine uncertainty is genuinely uncomfortable, and the developed mind is not comfortable with it. It is the built capacity to function effectively while the discomfort of the uncertainty is present, rather than requiring the resolution of the uncertainty before functioning can resume. The third distinguishing feature is the relationship to effort under conditions of uncertain outcome. The underdeveloped mind's effort tends to be contingent on the signal of progress, on the external feedback that the effort is producing the intended result. When that signal is absent, when the work is hard and the outcome is uncertain, and the current performance is below the eventual standard, the underdeveloped mind's investment in the effort reduces. The developed mind has built the specific capacity to sustain the investment in the effort under conditions of uncertain outcome, driven by the internal standards and the assessment of the effort's genuine value rather than by the external signal of immediate progress. Strength is revealed during adversity because adversity is the condition that removes the disguises. In comfortable conditions, the underdeveloped and the developed mind may produce similar behavioral outputs. The external circumstances do not require the specific capacities that distinguish them. Adversity removes the comfortable conditions and directly engages the specific capacities that make the difference. The mind that has built those capacities is revealed as strong. The mind that is not is revealed as having the specific gap that the adversity identified. Both revelations are useful. The strong revelation confirms the development. The weak revelation provides the precise diagnostic for where the development still needs to go. Chapter 3: Psychological Resilience. Strong minds bend, weak minds break. The metaphor of bending versus breaking is worth examining with precision, because it captures something about resilience that is frequently lost in the cultural narratives of mental strength. The image that mental strength often calls up is hardness, the impenetrable surface. The person who does not bend, who does not show the effect of the force applied to them. This image is wrong, and the wrongness is specifically costly because it directs the development of mental strength toward the suppression of the experience of difficulty rather than toward the genuine capacity to process and return from it. The hard material, the one that does not bend, breaks when the force exceeds the hardness. The flexible material, the one that does bend, absorbs the force through the deformation and returns to the original form when the force is released. The resilient mind is the flexible one. It is fully affected by difficulty, bends under genuine pressure, and returns to functional capacity when the pressure reduces. The apparent strength of the hard mind, the one that shows no effect of the force, is the brittleness of material that will shatter when the force is sufficient. Psychological resilience, in the precise sense, is the return capacity, the specific ability to be fully affected by difficult conditions and to return to functional capacity from that impact, not the avoidance of impact. Not the pretense that the impact did not occur. The genuine absorption of the impact and the genuine recovery from it, the full cycle of being affected and returning, rather than the half aisle of either not being affected or being affected without returning. The return cycle is what most people's intuitions about mental strength miss, and the missing is consequential. The person who suppresses the experience of difficulty, who presents the hard surface and refuses to acknowledge the impact, has not completed the resilience cycle. They have stopped the cycle at the suppression stage, which means the impact is present in the system in the unexpressed, unprocessed form. In this form, it tends to emerge later, in less controlled conditions and with greater intensity than it would have had if the genuine absorption and return cycle had been allowed to complete. The completed resilience cycle has specific stages that are worth understanding, both because the understanding normalizes what the cycle requires and because it identifies the specific practices that support each stage. The first stage is the genuine absorption, the full acknowledgement of the impact that the difficult condition has produced. The loss is real and is experienced as real. The failure is genuinely disappointing, and the disappointment is experienced as genuinely disappointing. The setback is genuinely costly, and the cost is acknowledged. This absorption is not the dramatization of the impact, it is the honest, undefensive acknowledgement of what has actually occurred. Without it, the resilience cycle cannot begin, because the system is managing the suppression rather than processing the experience. The second stage is the regulated processing, the deliberate engagement with the experience from the regulated internal state rather than from the fully activated one. This stage is what distinguishes the resilience cycle from the reaction cycle. The reaction cycle moves directly from the impact to the behavioral output, driven by the activated state. The resilience cycle inserts the regulatory layer, the physiological regulation that reduces the activation level, the cognitive redescription that strips the catastrophization from the accurate assessment, and the narrative examination that separates the specific bounded impact from the generalizing story the pattern matching system is trying to tell about it. The third stage is the specific extraction of what the difficulty provides. Every genuine difficulty has specific information content about the current state of the capacities that the difficulty was testing, about the specific areas where the development is most needed, about the features of the environment and the relationships within it that the difficulty has revealed. The extraction of this information is not the forced positive reframing of the difficulty as a blessing in disguise. It is the honest assessment of what the difficulty has specifically revealed that was not previously visible, and the deliberate incorporation of that information into the developmental understanding. The fourth stage is the return, the deliberate re-engagement with the functioning that the difficulty temporarily disrupted. Not the immediate return as if nothing happened. The genuine impact was absorbed, and the genuine recovery takes the time it takes. The deliberate return is the specific orientation toward the reinstatement of functional effectiveness, what specifically needs to happen for the disrupted capacity to be available again, and what is the first specific step in that direction. Strong minds bend. They bend fully the full absorption of the impact that the genuine resilience cycle requires, and they return the full cycle completed, the system restored to functional capacity, the specific information that the difficulty provided incorporated into the developing architecture. The weak mind breaks not because it bends too much, but because it never built the specific regulatory and processing capacities that allow the full bending of genuine absorption to be followed by the genuine return. Building those capacities is the specific project of psychological resilience, and it is built the same way all the capacities in this audiobook are built, through the consistent, progressive practice of this cycle across the difficulties that ordinary life continuously provides as training material. Every difficulty you have absorbed and returned from is a completed resilient cycle that has incrementally strengthened the capacities that produce the return. The architecture is already more developed than it was before the difficult experiences you have navigated. Building it further explicitly, deliberately, with the understanding of the high stages and the practices that support each is what this chapter initiates and what the subsequent chapters develop. Chapter 4: Controlling Your Inner State. The strongest people control themselves first. The governance of the inner state is the foundational capacity from which all the other dimensions of mental strength emerge. Not the most visible, not the most dramatic, not the quality that the external performance of mental strength most clearly demonstrates, but the one without which the other dimensions are not reliably available in the conditions that most require them. The inner state, in the specific sense used in this chapter, is the current condition of the cognitive and physiological system, the activation level, the emotional quality, the quality of attention and deliberate processing, the degree of access to the full cognitive architecture. This condition is not static. It changes continuously in response to the incoming stream of experience. And the direction of change is significantly influenced by both the external circumstances and by the specific practices of the person navigating those circumstances. The inner state is managed, or it manages you. The strongest people control themselves first. This statement has a specific priority claim embedded in it. The governance of the inner state precedes the governance of everything else. Not because nothing else matters, the external situation, the relationship dynamics, the professional circumstances all matter significantly, but because the quality of every engagement with those external elements is entirely determined by the inner state from which the engagement is conducted. The person who is attempting to govern the external situation from an ungoverned inner state is attempting to produce ordered outcomes from a disordered cognitive process. The specific dimensions of inner state governance that mental strength requires are three, and they are interdependent in ways that make the development of each both independent and mutually reinforcing. The first dimension is physiological regulation, the management of the body's contribution to the inner state, the activation level produced by the stress response. The cognitive quality degradation that the panic zone produces, the specific physiological changes that translate external pressure into internal cognitive impairment. The physiological regulation practices the breath regulation that engages the parasympathetic system. The deliberate physical slowing that reduces the body's urgency signals, the specific attentional practices that reduce the cortisol flooding the working memory are the most direct and most rapidly effective interventions available for inner state governance. They work at the physiological substrate rather than at the cognitive level, which means they produce real changes in the neurological state rather than only in the narrative about it. The second dimension is cognitive regulation, the management of the thinking processes that the inner state is producing, the narratives, the interpretations, the attributions, the catastrophizations that the emotional system generates automatically and that the deliberate mind must examine, correct, and govern if the inner state is to remain functional. The cognitive regulation is built on the inner dialogue mastery described in earlier audiobooks of this series, applied specifically to the high-pressure conditions of genuine difficulty. In conditions of genuine difficulty, the cognitive system produces specific and consistent distortions, the permanent attribution "this will always be this way." The pervasiveness attribution, this affects everything, and the personal attribution, this is specifically about my inadequacy. These three distortions, which together constitute the cognitive signature of the helpless response to adversity, are the specific targets of the cognitive regulation practice. The examination practice asks, is this actually permanent, pervasive, and personal? And the honest answer, in almost every genuine difficulty, is that the difficulty is temporary in duration, bounded in scope, and not reducible to a statement about fundamental personal inadequacy. The third dimension is intentional orientation, the deliberate maintenance of the forward-pointing direction toward the specific next useful action, the specific most important present task, the specific dimension of the situation that is within the scope of influence, rather than the backward and outward orientation that difficulty naturally produces. Backward orientation is the rumination on what went wrong, why it went wrong, who is at fault, what should have been done differently. Outward orientation is the focus on the elements of the situation that are outside the scope of influence, what others should do, what the circumstances should be, what the institutional or relational structures should provide. Both backward and outward orientations are natural. Both are sometimes genuinely useful. The honest assessment of what went wrong informs the development, and the accurate understanding of external factors informs the strategic navigation of them. The problem is the disproportionate investment in these orientations, which consumes the attentional and cognitive resource that the intentional forward orientation requires. The deliberate maintenance of the forward orientation, the specific question of what the most useful action available in the current moment is, and the specific direction of effort toward that action is the intentional regulation practice. The three dimensions of interstate governance are practiced in the ordinary daily situations that produce the ordinary daily demands on the interstate. Not only the major crises, the ordinary frustrations, the minor failures, the small pressures of routine difficulty. These ordinary situations are the training ground for the interstate governance capacities. The person who governs their interstate consistently in the minor situations is building the architecture that governs it in the major ones. The architecture is cumulative. Every practiced instance of the physiological regulation, the cognitive examination, and the intentional orientation is an increment of the developed capacity. The strongest people control themselves first. The governance of the interstate is the control that precedes all other control, the prerequisite for the effective functioning that every other dimension of mental strength depends on. Without it, the other capacities are available only in comfortable conditions. With it, they are available in the conditions that most require them. Chapter 5. Discipline over motivation. Motivation fades, discipline remains. The difference between motivation and discipline is not a difference of degree. It is not that discipline is simply stronger or more persistent motivation. It is a difference of kind, two entirely different mechanisms for producing consistent behavior, with entirely different reliability profiles, entirely different relationships to the conditions in which they are called upon, and entirely different developmental trajectories. Motivation is the alignment between the current internal state and the action that the internal state is driving toward. When motivation is high, the action feels natural, even compelling. The internal state is generating the impetus, and the effort is experienced as self-sustaining. The problem with motivation as the primary engine of consistent behavior is this: the internal state is not constant. It fluctuates in response to energy levels, emotional weather, the feedback from the environment, the progress or lack of progress toward the goal. Motivation, as a function of the internal state, fluctuates with it, and the internal state is most depleted. Motivation is lowest in precisely the conditions where the consistent behavior is most required: the extended difficulty, the sustained effort without obvious progress, the demanding conditions that exhaust the resources that motivation depends on. Discipline is the behavioral commitment that operates independently of the current internal state. It is not driven by how the behavior feels in the current moment, by whether it feels aligned with the current internal state, by whether the motivation to do it is present, by whether the conditions are favorable or unfavorable. It is the decision made in the committed state, the clear-minded, relatively undistorted, genuinely intentional decision that governs the behavior in the conditions where the current internal state would govern it differently. The distinction in practice is the distinction between acting when you feel like it and acting when you do not feel like it. But the second option is not the gritting of teeth heroism of forcing yourself against your nature. It is the specific cognitive discipline of recognizing that the current feeling is the activated, depleted, or distracted internal state, which is not the state in which the behavioral standard was set and is not the state from which the behavioral standard should be revised. The behavioral standard was set by the deliberate mind. The temptation to revise it is being produced by the activated, depleted, or distracted state. The discipline is the recognition of this and the consequent governance by the deliberate standard rather than by the temporary state. Motivation fades. This is not a failure of character or commitment. It is the natural behavior of a system that runs on resources that are consumed by use and replenished by rest. The person who is working at the genuine edge of their capacity, in conditions of genuine difficulty, for extended periods, will run low on the resources that motivation depends on. This is the design behavior of the system, not a failure of its design. What the system was not designed to produce automatically is the discipline that governs behavior when the motivational resources are depleted. That must be built. The building of discipline as a behavioral architecture requires three specific elements. The first is the pre-commitment, the explicit, deliberate setting of the behavioral standard in the clear-minded state, formulated specifically enough that it governs the behavior in the conditions where the motivated compliance with it would be easy to provide, and the unmotivated compliance is the test. The pre-commitment is not the general intention, it is the specific decision at this time. In this context, I will do this specific thing regardless of how I feel about it at the time. The second element is the identity integration, the deliberate connection of the specific behavioral standard to the person's self-concept as someone who maintains that standard. The person who experiences the maintenance of the behavioral standard as the expression of who they are rather than as the effortful compliance with an external obligation draws on a different and more durable motivational structure than the person who experiences it as a burden. The identity integration makes the standard a self-expression rather than a compliance. The third element is the friction reduction, the deliberate arrangement of the behavioral environment to reduce the specific obstacles that the unmotivated state uses as reasons for non-compliance. The person who does not feel like exercising in the morning will find more reasons not to exercise if the process of exercising requires additional decisions and additional effort in the low motivation state. Reducing the friction, making the compliant behavior easier to initiate than the non-compliant one, is not weakness or cheating. It is the rational management of the known properties of the low motivation state. The development of discipline is itself a discipline, the consistent practice of the behavioral standard across the easy and the difficult conditions. The many repetitions that build the neural infrastructure of the habit. The gradual reduction of the effortfulness of the behavior as the infrastructure builds. The person who has maintained the behavioral standard across many difficult instances, who has done the work when they did not feel like it, many times, and has accumulated the evidence that the undirected feeling was not the accurate guide to what they were capable of, has built something that the motivated person who has not encountered genuine difficulty has not, the specific self-knowledge that the standard holds even when the motivation does not. Motivation fades. Discipline remains. Not because discipline is emotionless or mechanical. The disciplined person may feel the pull of the easier option as strongly as anyone, but because the decision about which option to take was made in the clear-minded state and is being honored in the activated, depleted, or distracted state through the specific governance of the pre-commitment, the identity integration, and the friction reduction that the building of discipline provides. Chapter 6. Endurance of the mind. Your mind gives up before your body does. The limits of physical endurance are well documented and largely understood. What is less recognized and more practically significant for most of the challenges that constitute the genuinely difficult aspects of most lives is the specific pattern of mental endurance, the way the mind reaches its subjective limit before the objective capacity has actually been exhausted. The way the signal to stop precedes the actual depletion that would require stopping, and the specific implications of this for how the experience of the limit is managed and what the genuine edge of the capacity actually is. Your mind gives up before your body does. This observation from the physical endurance tradition applies with equal force to the mental and emotional endurance that genuinely difficult life conditions require. The experience of being at the limit, the sense that more is not possible, that the current level of difficulty cannot be sustained, that relief is necessary, arrives before the objective depletion that would actually prevent continuation. The signal is not inaccurate, it is a genuine indicator of significant consumption of the available resources. But it is not the terminal indicator it represents itself as. There is capacity beyond it, consistently and reliably, in every domain where endurance matters. The psychological mechanism through which the mind reaches its subjective limit before the objective one is the same mechanism described in Chapter 4 as the catastrophization sequence, the projection of the current difficulty into the future. The mind that is at the limit is not only experiencing the present difficulty, it is simultaneously modeling the future. If I feel this way now, and this continues, I will feel progressively worse for a progressively longer time. The combination of the present difficulty and the projected future difficulty is what produces the subjective sense of being at the limit. The present difficulty alone might be manageable. The present difficulty plus the projected indefinite future of similar or increasing difficulty is what produces the experience of being beyond what is possible. The specific intervention that allows the genuine capacity to be accessed beyond the subjective limit is the present moment restriction of the cognitive frame, the deliberate limitation of the assessment to the current moment. This period, this specific demand, rather than the extended future that the catastrophization is projecting. The athlete who does not ask how much further there is to go, but rather whether they can continue for this specific next interval, is not deceiving themselves. They are managing the cognitive frame in a way that makes the genuine continuation capacity available rather than obscured by the projected future difficulty. This interval-based approach to endurance applies directly to the mental and emotional endurance that difficult life conditions require. The question of whether you can sustain the current level of difficulty for the duration of the challenge is frequently genuinely unanswerable. The duration is uncertain. The trajectory is uncertain. The eventual outcome is uncertain. The question of whether you can continue to function at the current quality for the next specific interval, the next hour, the next day, the next week is answerable and is almost always answerable affirmatively. The endurance is built interval by interval, not in the single commitment to the full duration. The recovery practice is the second component of mental endurance, and it is the component most commonly neglected. The physical endurance tradition understands that sustainable performance across an extended period requires the systematic alternation of effort and recovery, that the continued performance without adequate recovery produces the degradation of the capacity rather than its development. The same principle applies to the mental and emotional capacities, and the neglect of the recovery practice is one of the primary reasons that genuine mental endurance is less developed than it could be in most people who are working hard and experiencing genuine difficulty. The mental and emotional recovery practices are the deliberate, specific activities that restore the depleted resources, the genuine rest from the cognitive demands of the difficult situation. The activities that restore rather than consume the emotional resources, the periods of deliberate disengagement from the sustained effort that make the re-engagement more effective than the continuous effort without recovery would have been. These are not laziness. They are the specific maintenance of the system that makes the genuine endurance possible. The specific content of the recovery practice varies between individuals and must be discovered through honest attention to what actually restores rather than what appears to restore. Some activities that feel like rest or actually demands on the same systems that the work depletes. The social media scroll that feels passive but maintains the attentional fragmentation that the focused work was producing. The conversation that feels relaxed but maintains the emotional engagement that the difficult relationship was requiring. Genuine recovery requires the honest identification of what actually restores the specific depleted resources rather than the activities that feel like alternatives to work. Mental endurance is also built through the progressive loading practice described in Chapter 8 of the Calm Under Pressure audiobook, the deliberate exposure to challenging conditions at the level that extends beyond the current comfort zone without overwhelming the regulatory capacity. Each cycle of genuine extension and genuine recovery builds the capacity for the next extension. The architecture of endurance is built this way not through the single heroic effort that depletes completely, but through the consistent pattern of genuine extension followed by genuine recovery, repeated across many cycles, building the capacity progressively beyond where it currently is. Your mind gives up before your body does. The management of the subjective limit, the recognition of it as a signal rather than a terminal. The interval-based continuation, the systematic recovery practice, and the progressive building of the genuine capacity is the specific practice of mental endurance, not the heroic endurance of the person who never stops, but the sustainable endurance of the person who has built the capacity to continue, to recover, and to continue again across the extended duration that genuine difficulty requires. Chapter 7. Facing Fear Calmly. Fear disappears when you walk toward it. The statement in the hook is psychologically precise and requires the precision to be understood in its fullest sense. Fear does not disappear when you walk toward it in the sense that the walking eliminates the fear. The fear may be fully present through the approach. Fear disappears, or more accurately, fear reduces and eventually resolves because the sustained engagement with the feared object or situation removes the specific mechanism through which fear maintains itself, the avoidance that prevents the accurate assessment of what the feared thing actually is, and the prevention that keeps the feared thing enlarged by the imagination beyond its actual proportions. Fear operates through a specific psychological mechanism that avoidance reliably maintains and approach consistently disrupts. The mechanism is the maintenance of the feared object in the imagination rather than in the direct experience. The imagined feared object grows, it accumulates every threatening feature that the imagination can supply. Untrained by the accurate information that direct experience would provide. The direct experience, almost always, provides an object that is genuinely challenging but not as large, not as permanent, and not as inevitable in its bad outcomes as the imagination had produced. This is not the claim that all feared things are less harmful than feared. Some feared things are genuinely as harmful as feared. The claim is more specific. The imagination's version of the feared thing is almost always larger than the direct experience's version, and the avoidance that prevents the direct experience maintains the imagination's inflated version rather than the direct experience's accurate one. The person who walks toward the fear is choosing the accurate version over the imagined one. And the accurate version, while genuinely challenging, is the version that can be engaged with, managed, and navigated rather than the version that can only be fled from. The specific psychological mechanism of fear maintenance through avoidance is the operant conditioning of the relief response. When avoidance of the feared object produces relief when the person does not do the feared thing, and the discomfort of anticipation reduces, the brain records the association between the avoidance and the relief. The avoidance is reinforced as the mechanism that produces relief. Each subsequent instance of avoidance reinforces the association further, strengthening the fear avoidance cycle and making the next approach more difficult rather than less. The person who walks toward the fear is disrupting this cycle at its reinforcement point. The approach does not immediately produce relief. It typically produces the full experience of the fear, which is uncomfortable, but it also produces something that the avoidance never produces: the direct experience of surviving the feared encounter, of having engaged with the feared thing and emerged with the capacity intact, of having evidence that the feared object is survivable. This evidence is the specific ingredient that reduces fear over time through repeated approach rather than through sustained avoidance. Facing fear calmly is the specific additional discipline beyond simply approaching the fear. The calm facing is the approach conducted from the regulated inner state rather than from the fully activated one. The distinction matters because the fully activated approach, the forced exposure that does not include the inner state governance, produces a different experience and a different outcome from the regulated approach. The fully activated approach experiences the fear through the maximally amplified perception of threat that the fully activated state produces. The regulated approach experiences the fear with the more accurate perception of what is actually there that the regulated state maintains. The specific practice of facing fear calmly therefore begins with the inner state governance practices of Chapter 4, the physiological regulation that reduces the activation level before the approach, the cognitive redescription that strips the catastrophization from the accurate assessment of what is actually there, and the intentional forward orientation that maintains the approach direction against the behavioral pull of the avoidance instinct. The graduated approach is the practical methodology that makes the regulated approach achievable for fears of sufficient intensity. The graduated approach begins at the level of the fear hierarchy, where the regulated approach is possible where the inner state governance practices are sufficient to maintain the regulated state through the encounter, and progressively builds the approach toward higher levels of the hierarchy as the lower levels have been engaged with successfully and the evidence of survivability has accumulated. This is not cowardice, it is the specific progressive building of the approach capacity that the direct attempt at the highest level of the fear hierarchy, before the lower levels have been built, would likely not produce. Fear disappears when you walk toward it. The walking is specific, it is the regulated approach. From the managed inner state, conducted progressively across the full range of the fear hierarchy, until the direct experience has accumulated enough evidence of survivability to replace the imagination's inflated version with the accurate one. This replacement is the disappearance the hook names, not the elimination of awareness that something is genuinely challenging, but the dissolution of the imagined catastrophe into the accurate, manageable, survivable reality that the direct experience consistently reveals. The fears that are not faced remain large. The fears that are faced consistently and gradually reduce to their accurate proportions. The person who has built the habit of the regulated approach, who walks toward what is difficult rather than away from it, consistently and from the governed inner state, is building the specific evidence base from which the genuine courage that mental strength requires is drawn. Not the courage of the person who feels no fear, but the courage of the person who acts in the presence of it. Chapter 8. Emotional toughness. Being strong means staying steady. Emotional toughness is one of the most consistently misunderstood dimensions of mental strength, and the misunderstanding is costly because it directs the development in the wrong direction and produces the brittleness that it was supposed to prevent. The misunderstanding is the equation of emotional toughness with emotional hardness, with the suppression of emotional experience, the performance of immunity to emotional impact, and the cultivation of the affect-free engagement with difficulty that would theoretically render the person untouchable by the emotional demands of genuinely difficult situations. This equation is wrong in its logic and damaging in its consequences. It is wrong because emotional hardness is not strength, it is the brittleness of the material that does not bend. It is damaging because the pursuit of emotional hardness through suppression produces the specific accumulation of unprocessed emotional content that tends to emerge later, in more intense and less controlled forms than it would have had it been processed through the genuine resilience cycle. Being strong means staying steady. The steadiness that emotional toughness produces is not the absence of emotional experience, it is the consistency of behavioral quality across the full range of emotional experience. The emotionally tough person feels the grief, the anger, the disappointment, the anxiety with genuine intensity. What does not change is the quality of their behavior, their adherence to their own standards, their maintenance of the values and commitments that define their character. their continued engagement with the genuine requirements of their situation. The feeling is full, the behavior is steady. The development of emotional toughness is therefore not the suppression of emotional experience, but the building of the specific gap between the emotional experience and the behavioral output that several earlier audiobooks in this series have addressed from different angles. In the emotional toughness context, the gap is the specific interval in which the full emotional experience is received, genuinely felt, and then passed through the deliberate mind's governance before producing the behavioral output. The emotional content of the behavior is present. The person who feels deeply and behaves in accordance with their genuine values is not performing coldness. The behavioral quality is maintained even while the emotional experience is fully present. The specific development of emotional toughness requires the consistent practice of the gap in emotional situations, the many ordinary instances of genuinely feeling something and choosing the behavioral response rather than executing the automatic emotional output. These instances are the training sessions. The accumulation of many training sessions is the development of the quality. Not the single dramatic instance of heroic suppression, but the consistent practice across the texture of daily emotional life that builds the specific infrastructure of governed emotional expression. The grief dimension of emotional toughness deserves specific attention because grief is the emotional experience in which the misunderstanding of toughness as hardness produces the most damage. The person who is grieving a genuine loss and believes that emotional toughness requires not showing the grief, not acknowledging the grief, not allowing the grief to affect their functioning, is pursuing the hardness version of toughness that breaks rather than bends. The genuine emotional toughness in grief is the willingness to fully experience the grief, to allow it its full reality in the internal experience while maintaining the behavioral engagement with the genuine requirements of the situation. The two are compatible. The full experience of grief and the maintenance of behavioral quality are not mutually exclusive. They are the definition of the bending without breaking resilience described in Chapter 3. The person who is grieving and continuing to function at the genuine quality of their values is demonstrating emotional toughness. The person who is suppressing the grief and maintaining the external appearance of unaffected functioning is demonstrating hardness, and hardness, as Chapter 3 established, is the fragility that breaks rather than the strength that holds. The anger dimension of emotional toughness is the most practically demanded because anger is the most commonly triggering emotional state in the ordinary social and professional situations that constitute most of daily life. The emotional toughness practice in anger is the specific discipline of receiving the activation that anger produces fully, without suppression, and maintaining the behavioral standard that the person's genuine values and genuine purposes require. Not the suppression of the anger, which would be the hardness approach. The reception of the anger as information about what has been violated, what is important, what requires attention, and the behavioral response calibrated to the information rather than to the activation level. Being strong means staying steady. The steadiness is behavioral, not emotional. The emotional experience can be fully present, fully intense, fully engaged with, and the behavior can remain consistent with the genuine values and genuine purposes that define the person's character. This combination, full emotional engagement and maintained behavioral quality, is the definition of emotional toughness in its genuine form. Not the absence of feeling, but the governance of what the feeling produces as behavior. The emotionally tough person is not cold. They are warm, fully engaged with the emotional reality of their experience and their relationships. What they have is the specific architecture that keeps the warmth from becoming the governor of their behavior in the conditions where governance is most required. The architecture does not prevent feeling. It governs what the feeling produces. That is the specific form of strength that this chapter develops, and that the next chapter begins to consolidate into the unbreakable architecture that the audiobook has been building toward. Chapter 9. Building an Unbreakable Mind. Every difficulty is a mental workout. The workout metaphor for difficulty is one of the most practically useful cognitive reframes available for the developmental relationship to adversity, and it is worth developing with full precision rather than deploying as a glib positive reinterpretation of genuinely difficult experience. The workout metaphor works because it accurately describes the mechanism through which difficulty produces growth. Physical training produces physiological adaptation through the specific mechanism of stress followed by recovery. The stress of the training session produces mirror damage to the muscle tissue. The recovery period allows the repair and adaptation that produces increased capacity. And the next training session applies stress at the level that the increased capacity can now manage. The adaptation occurs in the recovery, not in the training session itself. The training session is the stress that makes the adaptation necessary. The recovery is the process through which the adaptation occurs. The same mechanism applies to the mental and emotional capacities. The difficulty is the stress that challenges the current level of the capacity. The processing and recovery that follows the difficulty is the period of the adaptation, the development of the specific capacities that the difficulty revealed as needing development, informed by the specific information that the difficulty provided about where the architecture is strong and where it is not. The subsequent encounter with difficulty at a similar or higher level then applies stress at the level that the adapted capacity can manage. Every difficulty is a mental workout. Not every difficulty is pleasant or welcome. Not every difficulty is proportionate to the growth it produces. Not every difficulty could have been prevented by better preparation. These qualifications are important and should not be dismissed by the workout metaphor. But within the acknowledged reality of the genuine costs of genuine difficulty, the developmental mechanism is real. The difficulties that are engaged with deliberately, processed through the genuine resilience cycle, and recovered from with the specific extraction of the information they provide do produce genuine increases in the capacities they tested. Building an unbreakable mind through this mechanism is not passive. It is not waiting for difficulties to arrive and hoping that the development emerges from the passive experience of them. It is the active, deliberate engagement with the difficulties that are present. The consistent application of the practices described in the preceding 8 chapters, and the specific management of the training cycle, the progressive loading, the genuine recovery, the specific extraction of the developmental information that produces the systematic development of the capacity rather than only the random, unsystematic exposure to difficulty. The 4 practices that constitute the deliberate training of the mind through difficulty are worth naming explicitly, because each represents a specific choice that the developmental orientation makes differently from the defensive orientation. The first practice is the honest diagnostic, the deliberate, non-defensive examination of what the difficulty revealed about the current state of the capacities. Where specifically did the architecture hold? Where specifically did it show the gap? What specific type of demand produced the degraded functioning? The honest diagnostic is the assessment that the defensive orientation avoids, and the avoidance is the specific reason the same difficulty tends to be encountered repeatedly without producing the development that the repeated exposure would theoretically provide. The second practice is the specific development investment, the targeted building of the specific capacities that the honest diagnostic identified as underdeveloped. Not the general intention to be stronger or more resilient, the specific practice of the specific capacity in the specific type of situation that the diagnostic identified as the challenge. The physiological regulation practice in the specific situations that produced the activation that was degrading the functioning. The cognitive regulation practice in the specific narrative patterns that were producing the catastrophization. The discipline practice in the specific behavioral domains where the motivation was most reliably failing. The third practice is the calibrated exposure, the deliberate seeking of the difficulty level that extends beyond the current comfortable capacity without overwhelming the regulatory architecture that governs the response to it. The difficulty level below the current capacity produces no growth. The difficulty level above the regulatory capacity produces the breakdown that the resilience cycle must then repair. The difficulty level at the genuine edge of the current capacity challenging enough to require the full deployment of the developed practices. Manageable enough to be engaged with from the regulated state is the specific level that produces the genuine growth. The fourth practice is the recovery investment, the deliberate, systematic allocation of the time and the activities that genuinely restore the depleted resources, as distinct from the activities that feel like recovery but maintain the depletion. The recovery is not optional, it is the period in which the adaptation that the difficulty produced is consolidated and in which the capacity for the next encounter is rebuilt. Neglecting the recovery produces the performance degradation that sustained effort without recovery reliably generates. Every difficulty is a mental workout. The outcome of the workout, whether it produces the growth that the mechanism is designed to produce or only the cost of the difficulty without the developmental return, is determined by the deliberateness with which the training cycle is managed. The person who has built the deliberate training orientation to difficulty is building the unbreakable mind not through the absence of breaks, but through the consistent practice of the full cycle, the stress, the honest assessment, the specific development investment, the genuine recovery, and the engagement with the next level of the challenge that produces the progressively stronger architecture that each completed cycle leaves behind. Chapter 10. Becoming mentally unbreakable. The strongest mind is the calmest mind. The statement that the strongest mind is the calmest one is the integration of everything the preceding 9 chapters have built, the point at which the individual capacities of resilience, interstate governance, discipline, endurance, fear-facing, emotional toughness, and deliberate training are no longer separate practices but a single, coherent quality of mind. The equation of strength with calm is counterintuitive to the cultural image of mental strength, which tends toward force, hardness, and the dramatic demonstration of the ability to withstand. The calmest mind as the strongest one requires the understanding of what genuine strength actually is, and everything the preceding 9 chapters have been building toward is the precise answer to that question. Genuine strength is functional capacity under the conditions that most degrade functional capacity. the capacity to think clearly when pressure is trying to narrow the thinking, the capacity to remain steady when activation is trying to destabilize the steadiness, the capacity to maintain the behavioral standards when the emotional state is trying to override them, the capacity to engage with fear rather than flee from it, the capacity to sustain the effort when the motivation has exhausted itself and only the discipline remains. Each of these is a dimension of the functional capacity that the difficult conditions are most specifically designed to degrade. And calm is the condition that best maintains each of them. The calm mind, the mind in the regulated internal state, with the deliberate cognitive processes accessible, with the intentional orientation toward the genuine requirements of the situation, is the mind that is most capable of clear thinking, maintains steadiness, behavioral standard governance, fear engagement, sustained effort, and emotional governance simultaneously. Not because calm is intrinsically powerful, but because calm is the condition that preserves access to the full architecture of developed capacities that the activated, suppressed, or exhausted state is progressively closing down. The calmest mind is the strongest because calm is the condition in which the developed capacities are most fully available. The strength is the developed capacities. The calm is the condition that keeps them available. The two are inseparable in the experienced expression of genuine mental strength. The person who is genuinely strong in difficult conditions is, specifically, the person who is the calmest, who has maintained the most complete access to their full developed architecture when the conditions were most specifically trying to shut it down. Becoming mentally unbreakable is the destination that this description points toward, the developed state in which the full architecture is sufficiently robust that it holds in the full range of difficult conditions the person is likely to encounter. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the genuine impact of genuine difficulty. The unbreakable mind is not the unaffected one. It is the one that consistently completes the resilient cycle, consistently governs the inner state, consistently maintains the behavioral standard through the emotional activation, and consistently extracts the developmental information from the experience. The identity dimension of becoming mentally unbreakable is the most important and the most slowly built. The person who has the practices but has not integrated them into their self-concept is applying techniques to an unchanged underlying identity. The person who has integrated the practices into who they are, who understands themselves as someone who faces difficulty rather than avoids it, who governs their inner state rather than being governed by it, who maintains standards through activation rather than only in comfortable conditions, is expressing an identity rather than applying techniques. This identity integration happens gradually through the accumulated evidence of many instances of the developed behavior. Each time the inner state is governed rather than allowed to govern. Each time the fear is approached rather than avoided. Each time the discipline holds when the motivation has failed. Each time the resilient cycle is completed rather than cut short by the suppression or the abandonment. Each of these instances is evidence that the person is the person who does these things, and the accumulated evidence changes the self-concept from the aspiration to the accurate description. The unbreakable mind is not the mind that was born strong. It is the mind that has been built strong through the consistent practice of the capacities that strength requires, applied deliberately across the difficulties that life continuously provides, until the practices are no longer the effortful application of a learned technique but the natural expression of a developed identity. This development is never complete. the capacities continue to develop through continued application. The architecture continues to be built through continued practice. The identity continues to be confirmed through continued evidence. There is no final achievement of the unbreakable mind. There is the ongoing direction of becoming it, which is the specific direction that this audiobook has been pointing from its first chapter, and that the 10 chapters of development have been building the path toward. The strongest mind is the calmest one. The calmest mind is the most developed one. The most developed mind is the one that has been built deliberately through the consistent practice of the capacities described in these 10 chapters, across the difficulties that have served as the training material, and that has become through the accumulation of the practice and the integration of the identity the natural expression of the person who cannot be shaken. Closing. The architecture of mental strength. 10 chapters, 1 developed architecture. The architecture is the integrated set of capacities, the resilience, the interstate governance, the discipline, the endurance, the fear-facing, the emotional toughness, the deliberate training orientation that together constitute the mental strength that stays unshaken in difficult situations. Not because the difficult situations are not difficult, because the architecture that meets them has been built to hold. Chapter 1 established the foundational truth: the tests are universal, certain, and the most honest information available about the current state of the architecture. The 3 categories of testing: acute, chronic, and developmental, and the somewhat different demands each places on the mental strength architecture. The developmental relationship to difficulty as the alternative to the defensive one, not the avoidance of difficulty, but the deliberate use of the information it provides. Chapter 2 mapped the distinction between the underdeveloped and the developed mind's response to adversity. The catastrophization sequence versus the accurate assessment sequence. The intolerance of uncertainty versus the built capacity to function effectively in its presence. The effort contingent on the signal of progress versus the effort sustained by the internal standard. And the diagnostic value of the distinction, the honest assessment of which responses the current architecture produces, is the most precise identification of where the development needs to go. Chapter 3 built the psychological resilience framework, the bending without breaking quality that distinguishes genuine resilience from the brittle hardness that the cultural image of strength tends to promote. The 4 stages of the resilience cycle: genuine absorption, regulated processing, specific extraction, and deliberate return. The central insight: the strength is not in the absence of bending, but in the completion of the cycle. Every completed resilience cycle is an increment of the developed capacity. Chapter 4 developed the governance of the inner state as the foundational capacity from which all other dimensions of mental strength emerge. The 3 dimensions: physiological regulation that addresses the activation at its neurological substrate, cognitive regulation that governs the narrative distortions the emotional system generates, and intentional orientation that maintains the forward-pointing direction against the backward and outward pulls of difficulty. The strongest people control themselves first because the quality of everything else is entirely determined by the inner state from which it is conducted. Chapter 5 built the discipline architecture, the pre-commitment, the identity integration, and the friction reduction that together produce the behavioral governance that operates independently of the current motivational state. Motivation fades because it is a function of resources that genuine difficulty depletes. Discipline remains because it was set in the clear-minded state and is honored in the depleted one through the specific governance of the pro-commitment. The building of discipline is itself a discipline, practiced across the easy and the difficult conditions, accumulating the neural infrastructure that makes compliance with the standard progressively more natural. Chapter 6 addressed the endurance of the mind, the subjective limit that arrives before the objective one, the interval-based continuation that makes the genuine capacity accessible beyond the subjective edge, and the recovery practice that makes the sustainable endurance possible rather than the heroic unsustainable effort that depletes without rebuilding. The mind gives up before the body does, and the management of the subjective limit through the present moment restriction of the cognitive frame is the specific practice that allows the genuine continuation capacity to be accessed. Chapter 7 developed the practice of facing fear calmly, the regulated approach that disrupts the avoidance cycle and replaces the imagination's inflated version of the feared object with the direct experience's accurate one. The specific mechanism through which avoidance maintains fear and approach reduces it. The graduated approach methodology and the courage that the practice builds, not the courage of the person who feels no fear, but the courage of the person who acts in the presence of it, consistently, until the approach has built the evidence of survivability that the avoidance was preventing. Chapter 8 addressed emotional toughness, the consistency of behavioral quality across the full range of emotional experience. Being strong means staying steady in behavior, not steady in feeling. The full emotional experience and the maintained behavioral standard are compatible and together constitute the genuine emotional toughness rather than the brittle hardness of suppression. The development path, the consistent practice of the gap in emotional situations. The many training sessions that build the specific infrastructure of governed emotional expression. Chapter 9 built the deliberate training orientation to difficulty, every difficulty as a mental workout, producing the adaptation that the training cycle makes available when managed deliberately. The 4 practices: the honest diagnostic, the specific development investment, the calibrated exposure, and the recovery investment. The difference between the deliberate training orientation and the passive exposure: the same difficulty produces development in the one and only cost in the other, because the deliberate orientation manages the training cycle that the passive exposure does not. And Chapter 10 named the destination the mentally unbreakable identity, not as a fixed arrival point, but as the continuously developing direction. The strongest mind is the calmest one, because calm is the condition that preserves access to the full developed architecture when the difficult conditions are most specifically trying to close it down. The identity integration through the accumulated evidence of many instances of the developed behavior, and the ongoing development that continues indefinitely as the direction, never a final completion. The tests will continue. The acute crises and the chronic difficulties and the developmental challenges implicit in every genuine aspiration will continue to arrive, as they have always arrived, in every life that is genuinely engaged with the things that matter. What is different now is the architecture that meets them. The difficulty arrives. You feel it. You govern the inner state. You maintain the standards. You complete the cycle. You extract what the difficulty provides. You continue. Not untouched. Unshaken. That is the strength.